Okay, now it's getting more and more interesting. So far we have covered different types, different design patterns. We have covered express.js middlewares, now redux middlewares. Redux middlewares solve different problems than express or other quad middleware. Quad is something similar to express, but the type of issues that a redux middleware could solve is different, because here we have redux and a flux pattern, or a pattern similar to flux. We have a reducer, we have an action, we have a dispatcher. So the entities of this word are different. Now we don't talk about HTTP requests. What we have here instead is we have actions, we have reducers, we have the components which are in charge of dispatching actions, and but overall, what happens in express.js and what happens in an express.js middleware and in a redux middleware is similar in a conceptually. Conceptually, it is similar. It provides a third-party extension point. Just think about it again. Pluggable infrastructure. It allows you plug-in infrastructure. All the actions, all the sequence of actions should be pluggable, and you should be able to plug and unplug actions in middlewares. We talked about it before. Right here, a third-party extension point. That extension point is exactly the same thing. The point that you could extend your application without changing the code. So now here in Express.js, the actions and the asynchronous operations that we had was about handling and managing HTTP requests, but here is between dispatching an action and the moment that it reaches the reducer. We have two different parts: dispatching an action and the moment that it reaches the reducer. So before we get more in depth, let me show you what it means. Let's say now we have a component here, groups.js. Oh, it is inside the action folder. Browse groups. Right here we have a component. What it does, it allows us to have a list of groups, and at some point right here it allows us to dispatch an action. This action comes from this actions groups.js file. If I just load user groups, look for this right here. Yeah, this is the action that I have used right inside this function. The point about this is, when we call this action, we know the pattern. I hope that we all know that this is how Redux works, that whenever we call this, whenever we dispatch an action or we call an action creator, what happens is it goes straight into the reducer. Let's see. Inside this function, inside this action creator function, I have used redux-thunk, by the way. And I'm going to show, again, redux-thunk is another type of Redux middleware, which allows us to create action creators like this, which helps us to have a really smooth structure, a much easier way of handling actions and reducers, because it allows us to create action creators. So the way that redux-thunk works is like this. It allows us to create a function. Inside that function, we have to return the actual function that we want it to be called when it is called like this inside the component. So when I call load user groups, this function that now I have highlighted is going to be called actually, not this one. So to make sure we plug everything correctly, what we have to do, this is what we have to do. We have to first import the action creators like this, and we have to use Redux. It has bind action creators, and we call bind action creators, and we pass action creators to that. And this actions would be bound to my props inside the components. Map dispatch to props. Now, after adding this map dispatch to props, inside my component, I'm going to have something like this. This.props is already available. And now it has something like this, actions. So all of the action creators now has been added to the actions attributes, and I could use it. This is how redux-thunk allows us to create action creators, Redux and redux-thunk, so which is a really interesting way of handling actions. Anyway, but the main important point here, this is the point that we just covered, we were talking about right here, between dispatching and action. So this is the action creator, and inside that function what we do is like this. This is, for instance, what it does. It loads the list of all the groups in database. It calls the API that I have created inside API folder. Anyway, but what it does, it is an asynchronous operation. Before calling the API, what I do, I dispatch an action. So this action again comes from this function. So yeah, this is the actual action. Why I have created a function, it is a signature that I feel comfortable with. But if you don't feel comfortable with that, you could just do this. This is the same thing. What I do here, I dispatch an action object, and the type of that is like this. Now the next step, all of this is handled by Redux. When I dispatch an action, it goes right straight to the reducer. Right here, groups.js, I have this case here, exactly this point. Okay, we have two different points. First is this, the point that we dispatch an action, which I just showed you, dispatching an action. And another point, the moment it reaches the reducer, right here. Between these two moments, so if we don't add any Redux middleware, then nothing is going to happen. Redux is going to just call our reducer function. But between these two, we actually have a pipeline. Between these two, we could have an asynchronous sequence of actions. So to do what? To do whatever you want to. You could load the data. You could log something. You could dispatch some. You could report something. Now let us go through the notes. I guess now we know what we are talking about. A Redux middleware. It is a third-party extension point. Extension point here means that we are able to extend the application at that point, which adds that action to a pipeline which happens between these two moments, dispatching an action and the moment it reaches the reducer. People use Redux middleware for different reasons, like logging, crash reporting, talking to an asynchronous API, routing, and etc. It is highly recommended you take a look into Redux middleware document that I have here. I have showed you before. This document is really, really thorough, and and comprehensive enough almost for everyone. Especially the first part, which is an in-depth intro to help you understand the concept, understanding middleware. Okay, now, what it has, Redux has a function called apply middleware. The extension point that we talked about is exactly apply middleware function. So you could pass it your middleware, and it adds that middleware to the pipeline, to that series of actions, to that series of asynchronous actions that we have in our process, but right now, in this case, between action and reducer. This is the logic behind that apply middleware function. Just let us read the code. So, apply middleware function, it receives two different parameters: a store, which is the Redux store that we use inside our React application, and a list of middlewares, not just one middleware. If you have one middleware, you could just pass an array with one single object in it, or let's say a function actually, because a Redux middleware is a function similar to express.js middlewares. Middlewares, what it does, it just slices the middleware because it doesn't want to manipulate and change the actual list of middlewares, because you might want to use that later in other parts of your application. But if it changes that at this point here, the next line, you see it reverses the list of middlewares, and it is exactly this, because that was exactly the list. If you remember, I said the order matters. Based on the order that you add your middlewares to that pipeline, Redux is gonna execute all of the middlewares. That's why it has to reverse, so that it could have access to the first added object like this. So this whole thing, that if you just simply use a store.dispatch, it doesn't do anything other than dispatching and going to the reducer. But this whole apply middleware thing is interesting because it creates a new dispatch function. If you take a look at this function, it stores the dispatch inside this variable. It iterates over the list of middlewares that you pass, and inside that it creates new dispatch functions. So this is the interesting part. We as developers, when we want to create a middleware, the middleware that we create, we should have this signature. You see, it has two function calls. It has to return a function at this point, this middleware that we have here. It has to return a function. That function should receive the store as its argument, and the return function itself again, it has, the middleware is a function which returns a function, and that function which has been returned should receive the dispatch as the original dispatch as its argument. Now we have a new dispatch. Again, this new dispatch is a function, which means we are in charge of calling that dispatch, the way we want to. I'm going to show you, actually. I have it in my notes right here. And at the end, what it does, it returns this object, which is our store. But this store has a function called dispatch. Now this dispatch has all of the other dispatch. All of the other middlewares has been already attached to this store.dispatch. Okay. Let me show you one example. this is the logger, for instance, example. I have copied and pasted from the document, redux-middleware document, but just let's take a look at this. As I just said, the middleware should be a function, which is a function, as you see. That function should return a function, okay? It does return a function. And what it does, it receives next. So what is that next here? This next actually, the name of it is next to remind us the express.js middleware next, because it is exactly the same thing. A callback function. If you want to do some kind of asynchronous operation call in your Redux middleware, after doing whatever you want to do, you should call this next. This next actually is exactly this dispatch that is being passed by apply middleware function. This apply middleware function is just a simple, logic. This is just a naive implementation. This is not the actual Redux API. It is much more complicated. But the main structure of apply middleware looks like this. It reverses the middlewares and attaches all of the dispatch, all of the middlewares like this to the actual dispatch of the store. Now, store.dispatch has all of these middlewares attached. The point is, the signature of it looks like this. That's why whenever you want to create a Redux middleware, you create a function. That function returns a function. Again, we have 3 functions here, and the most nested one is the new dispatch function that you wanted to be attached to that pipeline. This is a dispatch function that you want to be called whenever any dispatch happens. So just take a look at this. For instance, to create a logger middleware, this is what we have to do. The main logic of the code happens right here. Console.log dispatching an action, let result equal. Take a look at this. This is exactly where next action. This is exactly where it goes into the reducer and calls the main logic that we have inside that, and then log something else. So this is the moment. You could have access to the moment before that, dispatching an action, or after that. At this point, the logic has been already the code that the application developer has provided, has written, now has been executed. Now what we could do, we could just log something in the console. At this point, when you call this next, what happens if you just add a breakpoint? You could just simply end up right here inside your reducer. So if you add a breakpoint like in this line of Redux, in this line of your middleware, and add another breakpoint here, what you will see is after that moment, before this line, this reducer is being executed, because the reducer call happens inside this next action. So let's just take a quick look. The other one that I have just copy and paste is crash reporter. It's quite similar, but what it does is simply it doesn't want to log. What it wants to do is just simply call the function, and if it crashes or if it throws an error, then it catches that and does something. And at this point, what it does, it actually captures the exception. This is exactly what it wants to do. Okay, Raven is a library exactly for catching exception. Now, this is, at the end, this is the way that we could register, one more time, the extension point, third-party extension point that we could add third-party middlewares is right here now. The point that we call the create store, redux create a store function, we could pass this a list of middlewares, the result of apply middleware. So apply middleware again comes from Redux itself. We just had a look into its the big picture of its logic, reversing, attaching this middlewares to this patch and returning the new store. So this is what it the return value of this object that assign would end up here as the second argument of create store. So create store again comes from Redux. Now your store has all of the middlewares that you have added here. Okay, that's this. It was all of my notes. Let's go to the code. Great. Now what I'm going to show you is a middleware right inside my store folder. I have created a file called workshop middleware, and now I have two different middlewares. One is before logger middleware and the other one after logger. Before logger is again similar to what we have here, what I just showed you. It is simply a logger, but I don't want to log what you see here, right here. I don't want to log, for instance, the after part. I just want to log something before the actual reducer function is called. So the log that I have is called workshop before middleware, before calling the action and the name of the action. Let's take a look at the signature. The main middleware is called before logger middleware. It is a function. It receives the store object. I haven't used that store object here, but in a real world application, if you need to set up a middleware, you usually need to have access to the store object as well. But anyway, what I'm going to do here is just to log this. This is the only thing that I want to add. What I have here is simply similar to adding this line of code right before all of my reducer calls. If I want to do this, if I want to remove this, if I want to add this manually without using a middleware pattern, the way that I could handle that is just to add that to the first line of my reducer function. But not just here, I have to add that to all of my reducer functions. Or instead of adding that to all of my reducer function, I could simply put it right here and register this function as this function as a middleware. The second function that I have after logging middleware is quite the same with difference. And it just registers, as what it does, it logs the dispatch results here. This function that we have next, when we call that, it returns something, and we usually just return the return value of the next call. But at this point, I want to know what is the result of that, next call. And this next is exactly, again, if you want to, you could make it synchronous. Make it asynchronous. You could have a set timeout. You could have an API call. You could do whatever you want to do. You could wait for minutes and then call your function. Which means if you do that, the process of calling a reducer is going to take much longer. for every single dispatch, you are going to pause the application for a couple of seconds. If I do, for instance, set timeout 2 seconds right here. Okay, now what I have here is just the name of the action and the result of that dispatch result, dispatch call right here. And I have a try catch, and if any error happens, I want to throw an exception. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. If I want to, I could add a console.log, but if I don't want to do anything, the try catch is not necessary, because this function has been already wrapped inside the try catch by Redux itself. But if I want to add a logic of some sort to capture the exception or do whatever I want to inside that catch, then it makes sense to wrap it inside a try catch. But never forget to throw this error. If you don't do that, you are going to have, problems, because even though if you want to try catch, add this try catch, which means you want to catch the error, but in higher levels of this, or in the lower level APIs of Redux, we already have all of this wrapped inside a try catch, which means if you don't do this, lower level APIs of Redux are not going to catch this error and this, circle, that this data flow that you have, Redux data flow, is not going to work as it should. So this is a try catch that I have, but in my case, I don't want to do anything. That's why I'm not going to add this. I'm going to remove it. Okay, now let's see how it works. Okay, now I have created my middlewares. Let's use them. Where I could do that, where I could register my function, my middlewares is inside my configure store function. So in a simple React/Redux application, what we usually do is, let's go to the server.js, write configure right here. Instead of creating a configure store function, what we could simply do import from Redux and simply use that, import the create store function and call this create store instead of configure store. But in a real world application, since we need a bunch of different types of middlewares and a lot of code, instead of calling that create store directly, what we usually do, we create a module called create configure store, which is just simply a function, but it behaves like this. It receives the initial state. It has if you look at this, for instance, it checks if it is in the development mode, then it adds this logger to the list of its middleware. If you remember, we talked about it before. Using this design pattern, using this pattern, middleware pattern, we could simply set up two different environments. We could have two different pipelines for two different environments, one for production and the other one for development. And this is where you add new actions, new middlewares to that pipeline right here. So let's see how this code works. What I have created is the most basic function. This is the most basic function that we could create as configure store, which doesn't make any sense, because what it does is actually, it makes some sense actually, because it imports the reducer and passes the root reducer and initial state to create store. That's it. It doesn't do much. But if we want to extend it more, now we have to add a new middleware to that. So we have to first import apply middleware right here. I have it imported from Redux, and call that against my middleware. And at this case, the middleware that I have is called redux-thunk. Redux-thunk is simply a middleware. And so let's just change the name of this. Okay, apply middlewares, for instance. And if you remember, inside my notes, the signature of it looks like this: create store. The first part is the root reducer, combine reducers. The second argument is optional. The second argument is optional, which is the initial state, and the third argument is the result of apply middleware. So now in this case, I don't have the initial, in my notes, I don't have the initial state, but what I have instead is just apply middleware. Right. So now here I have I receive an initial state in my configure store, and I pass this middlewares to this function. So as you see here, I could simply put this here, apply middleware, and that's it. But when we talked about apply middleware function, we said it receives a store and a list of middlewares. This store here was just simply because we were trying to talk about the big picture, because in a real world, in the actual Redux API, the only argument that it receives is the list of middlewares. Or if you have only one middleware, you could pass it like this or like this. It doesn't make, in both cases, if you send an array, it checks every single item inside that array. But if you just pass one single object, it considers that object as the middleware. Again, that object, I said, but it should be a function, because Redux middleware is a function. Anyway, so now I could just change my code back. So, okay, now it's not that complicated. The next step here, this helper config part, just disregard that part for now. But if you are interested, it is one of the features that redux-thunk has. It allows us to create helper functions or helpers. Different types of helpers could be API call, could be functions, could be object, whatever we want to, we could have that. But in this workshop, this part just is gone. Don't consider that right now. The only part that matters is here. We have a list of middlewares like this, and thunk has, if you want to configure your helpers using redux-thunk, this is the signature of it. But it is actually, if you don't want to do that, this is all you have to do. So if I want to, what I could do is simply doing this: imports, what was that, from workshop middleware, and what was the name? One of them was before and the other one was after. If I want to now register new middleware, what I could do is just to add them here. But again, it is really important for you to understand that this order matters. Yeah, that's right. For now, for the two middlewares that we have created, the order doesn't matter at all. But we have a lot of cases that order matters. I mean, for instance, if you want to parse part of the action data that you have in your dispatch, so that the reducer could already have access to that, then you could do that. When I say parse, you should remember what we had when we talked about express.js middlewares, we used parse, cookie parser to parse cookies. We had body parser to parse the body, and inside our API calls we had that body. Now here, if you want something new added to your action, you should, and that's when that order matters. Okay, now if I do this, I'm gonna have that, this middlewares are gonna be called in an asynchronous sequence of action. When we talked about an asynchronous sequence of actions, we were talking, this list of array that you see, this is what we were talking about. So let's see the actual code. Configure a store right here. Exactly. So the rest that you see here are different types of middlewares that we usually use. For instance, in the development mode, right here, we have a logger, create logger. Again, it comes from, I have another file called logger, another module. Right here, I have one for the server side and the other one for the front end one. But let's take a look. Logger.server returns a function, and if you take a look at this function, create logger, it returns a middleware, and the signature of this middleware is exactly the same as what we talked about. Store, this is the first function, which receives the store. The second function receives next. And the final one receives the action. So this is the dispatch function that this middleware wants to have instead of the actual dispatch. So what it does, it just creates this payload object so that it could log that properly inside the console. That's it. And at the end, it returns next action, similar to our other our own middlewares that we have created here. So, or logger.client, these two logger.client and server are actual real world middlewares that we usually use. And Redux logger is a module that you could use for your, and you could use it inside your browser. It has a lot of features, and I'm going to show you those features if you want to. So, but the main part is right here. We have a list of middlewares, and we pass that. So we, change that array like this. We pass the logger here, middleware, and at the end we call apply middleware. So, and this is the result of that apply middleware is going to be passed to create store function. There is one more thing that you could see here. If it is, for instance, if you want to support hot reload in your, development mode, then you could use this, which is something that doesn't have almost anything to do with middlewares, but it's similar. It is related to the way that you want to set up your, your store. As you see, almost everything revolves around a store in a React Redux application. So let me now run the application. Okay, we have already done this before. Great. What I could do to have less logs, I could for now disable server.js. This express.js middlewares. But I'm not gonna push this code to the repository. So inside the repository, you're gonna have all of these custom middlewares. So now I guess let me just check one more time. Okay, great. So let me remove this extra line back to here because I just wanted to show you how it works. Great. So now this is the application. We are gonna talk about this application in the next session when we cover server-side rendering and Next.js and universal JavaScript, because this application has been created using the same principles, which is the purpose has been to create a universal JavaScript application. Anyway, so let me clear everything. So now what I'm going to do is just to create, for instance, let me just go to one page. Okay, workshop before middleware, before calling the action, and this is the action, as you see. Workshop after middleware, after dispatching the action, and this is the action. This is the result of the action. If you take a look at this, you could see this. I guess something in my code should change. Workshop. Sorry. Instead of console.error, I should have log. It was just. Okay. Great. So workshop, what it does, it loads the user list, so it should dispatch something. Workshop before middleware, before calling the action, and this is the action object. Workshop after middleware, after dispatching the action, which is this payload. This is the result of the dispatch. So yeah, dispatch result. This is the return value. So let's do something. Let's add something to the action. Let's pre-process something in our logic, for instance, and add something to the action. And let's see if it works. So we have to first make sure if it is an object. Type of action is an object. Before we do so, in some cases, even if action is null, type of action is object in some browsers. So we have to first make sure that we already have an action. Now we could change that. We could add something. Action dot, let's say, workshop attribute equals something like hello to middlewares. Okay. Now I have changed the action. So let's go to the reducer. Inside every single reducer that I have. Okay, by the way, I'm not using the default way of, reducers. I have created a function called create reducer. So you could see that here, which what it does again, it creates a function which receives a state, initial state, and the action, the actual action. So now as you see, it has a payload. Okay, let's just, because of this structure, what I'm going to do is just change my middleware. And instead of using this, let's import Lodash. Now let's just remove all of this on the line that's, for instance, has action. Using this, we are actually checking both at the same time. If action is an object, and if action has an attribute called the payload. And now we could just say on the line that is object. So what is object? Action dot payload. Great. So now action dot, I'm going to add that attribute to action dot payload. Okay. So because I'm adding this payload, actually passing this payload to my reducer functions. So this is the reducer, one of my reducer functions right here. That's just, what is it? Get user requests. Yeah, users. Let's go to the users reducer and get user list request. Let's add a debugger right here. And let's reload the page. This page is gonna dispatch. The first thing that this page is gonna dispatch is this action to load the user list. So I guess because of hot reload, I should wait. Okay, the debugger didn't work as it should. Let's just find the code right here. It was that reducers / users. Okay, we already have the debugger here. Okay, get user list. Okay, well, let's see what is this. Get user list success. Let's go for, no, I have added that to the wrong. Yeah, this is the one. Okay, great. Now we have this payload, and if we take a look at this payload has this workshop attribute. If we add that to all of our actions, you know, this create user request, for instance, all of the payloads now test outside test it's com and save this. Okay, again, it is, you know, the application, our component is trying to dispatch an action. It has already gone through all of our middlewares. Now inside this payload, again, I have this workshop attribute. That's how Redux middlewares work. And this was all I had planned to talk about in this session. I hope I have covered enough for you so you could now have a better understanding of this topic. But let's just, I guess I forgot to do something. Set timeout. I promised to create this, to pause all of our dispatch calls. Let's say with 2 seconds. Okay, now I guess we are gonna have a really slow application. So right here. And let's remove everything, all the breakpoints, and just reload the whole application. Now it should load much slower. As you see, it didn't render initially. It waited for 2 seconds. Let's just change this to let's just say 10 seconds, and let's see what happens. If you just take a look, even the server, because it has server-side rendering, is taking too much because we have added 10 seconds, and every single dispatch action on the server now is taking 10 seconds to reach the reducer. I guess 10 seconds was too much. Ah, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now it should appear. Voila. So this is how you could set up, actually this is not a good practice though, but this is how you could set up Redux middleware, and I hope you enjoyed this workshop.